Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I want to share with you 3 different ways you can alter and change your tissue paper for your creative projects. So let's get started. So let's first talk about tissue paper. In this case, I am using an acid-free tissue paper that I got from the art store. You can really use any tissue paper for this step. I would generally say stick to white tissue paper, but it really is a personal choice and what you're using it for on your project, whether or not you want it to be acid-free or not. So I'm starting with a piece of just regular tissue paper and I'm crumpling it up. And this is one of my favorite and easiest ways of altering tissue paper. And so now you want to have lots of wrinkles, but you don't necessarily want it to keep it in a ball. You want to lay it out again. And I want to put some crinkles in and still have some crinkles. Because I like the texture that you can get from crinkling the tissue paper, and you'll see some really cool effects as we kind of go along with this. Now we want to add color onto our tissue paper. So I'm going to use a combination of some of these Bombay India inks and acrylic paint, and I'm using a fluid acrylic paint specifically for this just because it will flow nicely. So when you're dealing with changing your tissue paper, I would say always stick to a permanent color medium, and you just want to add drops on your tissue. You can add a ton, you can add a little, it kind of depends on how dark or light you want this. And you might want to think about what colors work well together. So for example, red and blue do make purple. Well, if you put red and green in, you're probably going to get brown. So unless you really want brown, you may want to think through what colors you're using for this. And why I enjoy altering the tissue paper is just because it's a really great way of customizing your work. Sometimes I just like altering things. Sometimes you're maybe not finding the product that you want in the store that you're looking at. And so by using your own tissue paper and altering it, this is a fun way of just adding in your own take on things. It's also a nice way of color matching if you're running into using certain things in your projects that don't match anything else. I'm just adding in some copper paint here. And now I'm going to take a spray bottle and I'm just starting to spritz things. And you want to try to get things to move as much as you can. And you can move it a bit to try to get things to move on the surface. And just by pulling it up, you want to be very careful when you do this because it's now quite fragile because it has so much water in it, and you can tear it easily. And that's why a lot of the times the acrylic inks or the India inks work a bit better than the fluid paints. And I could have also used high flow paint. I was only using a fluid paint on this, which is why it isn't flowing quite as nice and is leaving more clumps. So that's kind of a lessons learned for me, that depending on how old some of my paint is, depending on what it's doing, that also affects kind of the final look that I get. And if you really want to try to move that copper around, you can always just take a paintbrush and just move it around. Add dots to other places. Thin it out a bit so instead of it clumping. And then you just can go back in and add some more water. And you can see that by the process of just crumpling this, now add some really interesting veins of color. Now that I've actually thinned my paint a bit, it's now moving a lot better. You'll notice that it looks fairly blue, but part of that is the blue mat underneath it. And I use a blue mat specifically for this just so I can pull it off to the side and let it dry. So there's gonna be lots of areas that are white. If you don't like the white, you can always add in more ink and just try to get a little bit of a different color. So I'm just gonna add in a tiny little bit of teal. I can kind of get away with the teal because I have like the blue and the red going on. I don't want to add a ton of it, but I think a little of it, especially next to the copper, will be a really fun look. And this is a chance just to add a little bit more color in places that maybe you have too much of one particular color. And you want to make sure you're putting this on a surface that you can just leave it to dry. And I've actually added quite a bit of water here, maybe even more than I usually do, but I just wanted to show you just how far you can kind of bring the blend. So now I'm going to pull this off to the side and let it fully dry. So I want to show you how you could use stamping, writing, and other things to add pattern to your tissue paper. You always want to use a permanent medium. For example, an archival ink pad is an oil-based ink, which works a lot better on the surface because when you want to add glue or wet medium onto it to attach the tissue paper, you don't have any issues. And so I'm just going to show you very quickly just how to add a few stamps onto your surface. It works the same way as any other stamping. And if you haven't seen my video on stamping fundamentals, I have included in the card above, just so you can reference that. So when you're adding your stamp to your tissue paper, add some ink to it, and there you get your image. You can just continue to do that until you have the images you want. And this is where you could use a lot of the same pattern, or you could mix up your pattern depending on what you want. And depending on what you're looking for, you could also use that second value, where you could go lighter, and then this could provide more dimension as you're working on your page. Because again, we don't have to always have the dark image. Depending on what you're looking for, you may want that lighter second value that you can get from stamping 2 or 3 different values. You can set this aside to dry, and you could make a choice to just collage onto your surface, or you could come in with a variety of mediums. You could use a wax crayon like this and just add in some color. And because these are wax based, they are not going to bleed. So you have a lot of variety for what you could use for just adding additional color onto your tissue paper. And as long as you don't press too hard, that works really well. The other option is you use something like a paint pen. But I think with the paint pen, because you can see even as I'm adding it, it is opaque, so it is going to cover things up. So something to be aware of when you're adding this to your designs is what kind of look are you looking for? Are you looking to try to cover up something, or are you looking to just kind of leave it as is? But this is also where you could take a pattern like this and then start adding in your own writing, hope, love. You could even add little dots. You could add little tiny flowers. There's so many different ways you could use this depending on where you want to go with it. I know that totally doesn't match style-wise. So let's say you didn't like that. You could always just go over it, and that ends up being color, and you could kind of work on adding color in around your butterflies depending on what kind of look you want to add to this for your final result. I wanted to share with you my aha moment this week when it came to stamping and tissue paper. So I usually end up stamping with images like the butterflies or whatever, and for imagery it's great. It does exactly what I want it to do. But I hadn't really thought about words and what that could mean for words. If you haven't seen my last 2 tutorials, you'll know that for both napkins and tissue, to help get a nice soft edge on them, you can basically just run your paintbrush around the edge. And I didn't use this technique as much in my last video because I was using the Dina Wakley collage sheets, which have a little bit of a different property than this tissue paper. So this tissue paper works a little bit more like a napkin, but is a lot stronger. Basically what you do is you run water around the edges, and we'll just tear until we hit the watery part, and then you just pull gently. And you'll see that gives you a very ragged edge, which you might go, well, that's kind of ugly. Why would I use that? But the beauty of it is when you add this with a matte medium or glue, what you run into is basically all that white tissue disappears. So you're left with just your words. And why this is such an aha moment for me is I realized that any title I want to add, any journaling I want to add that maybe I want to make sure it's just the way I want it worded before adding it, I could add to tissue paper and add onto my journal. And this is an example of this, where choose your own adventure. Usually what I would do is I would stamp on the uneven surface, realize I didn't get a great stamped image, and I would spend a lot of time filling with my paint pen. This time around, I did this technique. So I basically stamped my words on tissue paper. I did this exact technique and put them on. You can see in this spot here and this spot here, you can see a little bit of the white, but I could have gone back in and added a little bit of just along the edges, added in a little bit more watercolor, and allow that to disappear. It doesn't bother me, so I'm just kind of leaving it as it is. But I wanted to show you the proof of concept with this, where anytime you're adding lettering on uneven surfaces, or you're using imagery on uneven surfaces, and anywhere where maybe you're going to be struggling with being able to get the image to go down correctly, this aha moment for me with the tissue paper, that solves a lot of problems. That makes it really easy just to add the words that you want to add without having to worry about the evenness of your surface. So the third technique I wanted to show you is how you could use heavy gels and modeling paste with stencils to create really interesting textures to be added onto your tissue paper. So we're going to start with the modeling paste. I would say generally don't start with a paste quite this thick. I'm trying to use up the rest of this container because it is getting old and I try not to let my mediums dry out. And if you don't use mediums a lot, only buy as much as you think you'd use in maybe a year, maybe 2. This stuff does tend to age over time. Sometimes it gets thicker. Sometimes it just dries out and becomes a solid block. And so all I'm doing here is basically taking my palette knife and I'm just adding it to the surface. And I'm pushing pretty hard because this modeling paste is quite old and it is also quite thick. If you're looking for something softer, I would say fiber paste is one of my favorites. I think it's the most forgiving, especially for newer to mediums, because it does take watercolor mediums and other things really well. It has a really nice texture. I love the paper texture of it. And it's very easy to spread. And so I'm working this quite a bit, and most mediums are not nearly this challenging to put through. I'm just using an especially heavy medium. And again, as always, when you have the extra excess on your knife, just put it along back there. I'm just going to run this over one more time just to smooth it out and get a nice even coat on the surface. So what the modeling paste will do is it basically adds white onto the surface, but it's also very porous so that it will take inks and other paints. And so I am going to now use some extra heavy gel for this. You could really use any gel. I would say go the thicker, the better. The more wet the gel is, the more this may or may not work out. I find that sometimes what ends up happening is that the gel will be wet enough that it makes the tissue paper crinkle. And what this will do is this particular medium will dry clear. And what's nice about the dry clear is that you get a little bit more of a resist, or a little bit more texture and pattern, and a little less of just the white color. It's a little bit more subtle than using the modeling paste. I just wanted to show you just basically how to add these through a stencil onto your tissue paper. As you can see, you don't have to be super gentle, but at the same time you do need to be careful not to tear it as you're working. And I'm okay going over the sides, and that has more to do because I will probably rip around this anyways before I add it to my sheet. I'm gonna pull this one up. And so that's your gel. That's white, but will dry clear. And then sometimes you just need to pull gently. And then there's that very white modeling paste. So I did another sample. I was prepping for this video just so you can see what it looks like when it's dry, and so that I could show you how you can colorize this. So this is done with the modeling paste and this is done with the gel medium. You can see that it's pretty much just transparent, where again the modeling paste has a very white color to it. I also tried 2 other different mediums. One is with the Stamperia Crackle paste, and it wrinkled really, really badly. I'm gonna have to put this down very unevenly onto my surface, and what I was hoping for was a very flat image from this. Well, the TCW stencil butters ended up working very similarly to some of the golden products, except that has that really nice shimmer and color in. And what I like about these particular stencil butters is that because of the way they shine and because of the color saturation, it's something you're going to have a little bit of difficulty to get mixing your own color with paint. And so that's why I do keep some of this around as well. Now for coloring this tissue paper, now we can start going and adding different mediums and different colors. So I'm going to try using some of my gloss sprays. We'll see if they work. I find, oh yeah, today they are. And so this is again another type of acrylic paint. It's just in a spray format, and this particular one isn't working super well. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of the blue ink again, kind of on a purple and blue kick today. And again, this is where you can go back in and add some water if you want. You'll notice the gloss sprays, they're a fairly quick setting paint. So they will tend to set a little bit faster. But this is also where you can go in with your brush and just add color in places, or if you wanted a little bit more, having a little bit of touches along the top there. And that's why I love using mediums, and I love using especially the paste, because again, you can really get the white in there, but that white can be colorized, kind of turn into whatever you really feel like. I love that there's some deeper spots and some lighter spots, so you can really control this, or you could end up going quite loose with this depending on what kind of look you're looking for. And I purposely have been doing this on a piece of parchment paper so I can lift it off and let it set it somewhere else to dry. And I feel like that could use a little bit more color. So this is a high flow turquoise paint. You can see just the way that it moves. It is meant to be used very, very loose, but it is also very highly pigmented. So this way we can start adding a little bit of color. I also could spritz it and see it can move pretty well. And so if you wanted stuff to move between those cracks and crevices, you just angle your paper. And one thing I didn't mention in the first step when I was showing you just how to do a basic crinkle and color method, you don't have to necessarily crinkle your tissue paper. You could use it completely flat and just color it one particular color if that was the direction you wanted to go in. This is really an experiment. You can really go in so many directions with this. I like that some of the white and lighter spots are showing up. I like some of the turquoise. So now we're going to move on to the gel side. And maybe I will use a little bit more warmer colors, but I'm going to still stick with some of the red-blue side of things. And so depending on if you want to add just a little bit of color, a lot of color, that allows you to see more or less of that gel resist. Again, it acts very differently than the modeling paste, because the modeling paste is meant to soak up a lot of the color, while a lot of the gel medium, it has a slicker surface, so it's not going to act in the exact same way. And this is where you can just either use some water or your paintbrush. And depending on the paint and how much it likes to move, you may just need to go in there with your brush. There's more than one way you can deal with this, but this is the beauty of using tissue like this over napkins to add color, because napkins would disintegrate if you were trying to do this on. Tissue paper is quite a bit stronger, so it gives you a lot more options. I'm gonna go in and add some gold. Add tiny bits of Mechanis iron oxide as well along the other side. Gives it that more steel and deep color. It's gone a little bit more muted than I'd like. So I'm going to throw in some India ink and this nice bright cherry red. So I want to show you what they look like when they're dried. This one I let dry overnight. I wanted to make sure it had a full drying time. And so now when you look at it, you'll see there's areas of white and there's areas of wrinkles. So we have a few different ways you could apply this. You could apply it with all the wrinkles in place, or you could stretch it out where you end up getting a little bit more of those white areas, but you still get those wrinkles, because you look at these areas here, they have a lot of wrinkles that have been caused by this. So you don't have to put it on very crinkly, you can actually put it on fairly flat. I wanted to show you an example of how I use this in one of my pages. This is a piece where I use the background that I created. So in areas like this, I overlap and crinkle to make those wrinkles more pronounced. In areas like this, they're put on very smoothly, and some areas like this as well. So you can make a choice of having both on a page. You can have areas that you put on fairly flat, and other areas that you let them crinkle and add layers and just add texture to your page. So here's a dried example that we use both the modeling paste and the gel. And the modeling paste again has that nice white feel to it. I really like the look of it. The gel again is that a little bit more of a subtle look. When it comes down to this one, I want to show you a few examples in one of my journals of how I used a few of these pieces. So this example is where I use the modeling paste. So you can see that the color on the entire sheet, on the white you can see the beautiful color. You also can see the more variation in texture from that white modeling paste. It shows up a little bit differently on black, but this is really fun because you end up still having some of the color in the background. It's not nearly as contrasty as here, but that bright modeling paste really does come through and makes for a really beautiful design. And so this is a few different ways that you can use this paper on a couple different surfaces. So I hope you've enjoyed this video on how to alter tissue paper for your creative projects. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. If you'd be interested in seeing a tutorial about napkin collage, you can review it here. And if you would like to see one on how to use tissue papers as the main focus of an art journaling project, I have a full tutorial right here. I hope you have found this technique inspiring, that you take some time for some creative self-care this week, and I will see you next time.